General thoughts as we are here 5 weeks in.
I think that 5 weeks into the invasion of Ukraine, the Russians are actually doing pretty poorly. They claim that they're simply regrouping and getting ready to focus on the south and the west, but they really have been defeated pretty much in the area around Kiev. They've faced huge problems with low morale, abandoned vehicles, vehicles running out of fuel and ammunition. And by contrast, the Ukrainian army has done tremendously better than anyone expected. That doesn't mean that Ukraine's out of the woods yet, because I think the war is going to shift to a different theater. And of course, you have to remember that the Russians have responded to their failure to deal with the Ukrainian military by attacking Ukrainian civilians. And so Mariupol, this port on the Sea of Azov, has been reduced to ashes with still, thousands and thousands of people trapped there. So I don't want to pretend that anything good is happening, but in purely military terms, it does look like the Russians are being forced to pull back.
Would you go as far to say that it is a stalemate?
No, I don't think it's a stalemate. I think the momentum has been on the Ukrainian side certainly for the last week or so. They've actually pushed the Russians out of a number of towns in the neighborhood of Kiev, and even in the south, they've actually launched counteroffensives. So the Russians have actually been losing ground over the last few days. And the thing about a military conflict like this, a lot of it is about military logistics, and at a certain point you can't maintain a big army in the field in a foreign country. So it's possible that in future the Russian position will collapse more suddenly.
Is that still your view, that it'll be a sudden collapse, not a gradual collapse?
Well, nobody can really tell, but I do think that the overall level of losses is so severe that the Russians can't sustain this. People have been talking about bringing in this Wagner group, which is basically a bunch of mercenaries, bringing in Syrians, bringing in people from Central Asia, trying to conscript people from Central Russia. These are really all acts of desperation, because Russia has committed the bulk of its existing military forces to the initial invasion. Maybe a third of those forces are just knocked out of commission. The level of deaths has been really extraordinary. I mean, it's probably in the area of 10 to 15,000 killed in a month's worth of fighting, including 7, 8 very senior generals. And so this is not a level of combat losses that even a country like Russia can sustain for long.
If Russia were to find mercenaries or draft young men, how would they even get them into the country at this point?
Well, it's hard to move people. They're talking about taking people out of the Far East, which is 11 time zones away from where the conflict is. So logistically, that's very hard. The other bigger problem, I think, is just morale, because conscripts really don't want to be there fighting, especially now that they're beginning to understand how bloody the thing has been. I think that foreigners are just never as committed to fighting a war as people defending their own home turf. So I don't think that this is going to be a really powerful source of further escalation. I think the real thing that people are worried about, quite reasonably, is chemical and biological weapons, because the war is not a threat to Russia. The security of the country Russia is not at stake, but Putin's future is at stake. So it is an existential fight for his political future. And under those circumstances, it's not clear what he'd be willing to do. And I think an escalation to chemical or biological weapons is something that's in his power, and he's certainly ruthless enough to consider that.
Do you see a diplomatic end solution at this point?
I don't see a diplomatic solution coming out of these talks in Turkey right now. Really, for the Ukrainians to agree to anything, the Russians would have to basically go back to the positions that they occupied on February 24th. They'd have to give up all of the territorial gains, and I don't see Putin agreeing to that. And I don't see Ukraine agreeing to a ceasefire and any kind of diplomatic solution that rewards the Russians for their aggression. And so, for that reason, I think you might get a temporary ceasefire, but that would probably last only as long as the two sides, resupplied and figured out how to fight the next phase of the war.
Is that one scenario then, that Russia holds on to the territories it has captured and that's where the conflict ends?
I think that's, the Russians would like it if they could get a ceasefire now and that they could hold on to all of these newly captured territories since they began their invasion. That would be portrayed in Moscow as a victory for Putin, even though it falls far short of his original war aims. And it would be a real loss for Ukraine. And so that's why I don't think the Ukrainians are going to accept anything like that.
The territories that have been captured, what kind of assets on there? What landmass, percentage-wise, does that represent?
Well, the percentage landmass is not the most important problem. The big problem is the seacoast, because Ukraine is a big exporter, particularly of agricultural products. And in fact, the World Food Program has been saying that there's going to be, widespread hunger in many parts of the developed world because of the failure of both Russia and Ukraine to be able to export wheat and soybeans, sunflower oil, this sort of thing. And I think that's what's really critical. The Russians are basically blockading all of the Black Sea ports that Ukraine needs to keep its economy going and also to feed a large part of the world. And I think that our attention really needs to be focused on that and reversing that situation and allowing stuff to get out of Ukraine, which will also be necessary for any kind of economic recovery.
Is there any way that Vladimir Putin emerges out of this better off than he started? Or is he persona non grata on the world stage?
The level of sanctions that have been imposed on Russia are unprecedented, including the freezing of central bank assets and the like. And I think that they haven't even begun to feel the real impact of the economic sanctions. And I think that even if Russia somehow holds on to some of the territorial gains that they've made, it's hard to see how this is going to make Vladimir Putin look terribly good. The trouble, of course, is that the Russian people only get the propaganda that's fed through Russian media outlets, and that's why his popularity has actually gone up since the beginning of this invasion. I think in the long run, it's going to be hard to keep people from noticing the fact that all these body bags are coming back and their sons are no longer living, but it may take a while for that to sink in. And that will, in the end, I think, determine Putin's fate.
Would you go as far to say that the nightmare scenario, long run here, is Russia teaming up with China?
I think that there has been this burgeoning relationship between Russia and China that was apparently cemented, during the Beijing Olympics. But the Chinese are realizing that maybe this wasn't the greatest partner to sign up with, because you want to, glom onto success rather than to failure. So I think that they are being a bit more cautious. I think actually the biggest implication is really about Taiwan, because the Chinese have made moves and suggested that they might consider a military move to reincorporate Taiwan down the road. And I think the performance of the Russian military ought to give them pause, and also the response of the West to the Ukraine invasion, because the West has been much more determined to reverse it and much more unified than anyone expected. And I think that's something the Chinese will take into account.
Will the U.S. step in if China invades Taiwan?
The U.S. is much more likely to intervene directly in the case of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. Nobody wants to say that outright very clearly in advance, because I don't think the American people are agreed on whether that's a good thing to do, but there's a current policy of strategic ambiguity that suggests that yes, that could happen.
Are we headed towards World War III?
I think the fear of World War III is overblown if by that you mean actual escalation to nuclear weapons. I mean, that's something you always have to worry about. It is possible, but I think that people have realized, and even crazy dictators like Putin recognize that this is a pretty suicidal type of conflict to get into. So I don't think that that is likely to happen. I do think you could get a wider war that would include, direct conflict between NATO forces and Russian forces. That's one of the reasons I think the Biden administration has avoided calls for a no-fly zone, because that's what could result from trying to impose a no-fly zone. But you can't tell. If there is an escalation to chemical and biological weapons, you could get a wider war.
Do you feel like sticking your neck out this morning and telling me how this will look in a month, 3 months, 6 months?
I guess I don't feel quite comfortable in making a very specific prediction. The one thing I think is safe to say is that Putin is not going to succeed in anything like his original war aims. That, I just think, is off the table. I tend to think that his forces are going to be slowly expelled from Ukraine, and the Ukrainians are going to end up being recognized as the victors in this conflict. I just had a conversation with a whole bunch of Ukrainian businessmen and entrepreneurs a couple of days ago, and in that group, there's every confidence that they're going to win the war. So, I'll go with that outcome.
Will Russia take Kiev?
Oh, there's no way that the Russians can take Kiev. I mean, they couldn't do that at the beginning of the war when all of their invasion forces were intact, and given the losses they suffered, there's just no way that they can take the Ukrainian capital.
How long will the goodwill last for the refugees, millions of them, and how long will it take to rebuild the country and move those folks back home?
I think that the refugee problem is going to be a long-term one. It's going to take a lot of time to build cities like Kherson and Mariupol and Kharkiv, although a lot of the refugees are actually people whose homes are still there. They just don't want to be in danger of being shelled, and they want their children to be safe, and their parents and elderly relatives and that sort of thing. So I think if there actually is an end to the war and the Russians withdraw, a lot of those people could go back pretty quickly. The rebuilding costs are going to be enormous. You're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars. Quite honestly, the Russians ought to pay reparations, but getting that money out of them, I think, is going to be an uphill struggle. And I think that the West ought to not breathe a sigh of relief if there is actually a military victory by Ukraine, but there ought to be a recognition that that's not the end of the task, that rebuilding Ukraine is really something that needs to happen.
Would you go as far to say that there will be some kind of military withdrawal by Russia?
I think that the Russians are already withdrawing in the north from the area around Kiev, and I think that they may be forced to withdraw in the south as well. But that's really the area to focus on closely in the coming days and weeks.
What can we learn about democracy's role in world history from this?
There's been a lot of pessimism about the fate of global democracy in recent years because of the rise of Russia and China and other authoritarian regimes, in Venezuela, Iran, Syria, and the like, and also the rise of nationalist populists in the United States and Britain and many European countries. And I think that one of the things that this war may teach a kind of younger generation is why it's actually better to live in a liberal democracy than in an authoritarian country, because democracies tend not to do things like, silence their own citizens, quash the media, invade other countries, bring death and suffering to their neighbors. And I think that's an important lesson that people need to relearn.
Because right now, authoritarianism, it's thriving. Do you see an end to that?
Authoritarianism is not going to end. I think that Putin personally is facing a lot of challenges. If he's humiliated in Ukraine, I'm not sure that he's going to be able to hang on as the leader of Russia, but that doesn't end the struggle between authoritarianism and democracy. I mean, there's plenty of other authoritarians in other parts of the world, and I think it's important that people recognize there needs to be solidarity among democracies and that people need to keep struggling to fight back.
You've been getting poked at on social media about your book, End of History, and how it seems, the argument seems either outdated or incorrect, or maybe you spoke too soon. Anything you want to say back to your critics?
Well, look, a lot of the criticism at the end of history is based on not understanding what the concept meant. It wasn't about events stopping. It was about, the question of what lies at the end of the process of modernization or development. It's history with a capital H. And my original argument was that for 150 years, Marxists said the end of history would be communism. And I was simply saying that it didn't look like we were ever going to get there, that liberal democracy looked like the highest form of human, social and political organization. And that's where things were headed, and I think that still remains the case.
Do you think Russia will continue to be a superpower?
I think that Russia's prestige and global influence is going to be very diminished as a result of the kind of incompetence and failure that's already been demonstrated in Ukraine.
But if capitalism senses that there's money to be made in Russia, do you think that people will look past everything that's happened in Ukraine and begin making investments again?
I think that given the sanctions that have been imposed both by Europe and the United States and other democratic countries, it turns out that sanctions are actually pretty hard to reverse. We've had experience with that with South Africa and Libya and a lot of other places. And that's really what's keeping capitalists from investing in places like that. They don't want to run afoul of Western sanctions. So I don't think that there's going to be any mad rush to get back into Russia at any point.
What makes you optimistic and what keeps you up at night?
Well, the thing that makes me optimistic is just following the war on the ground, which still seems to be going the Ukrainians in the Ukrainians' favor. What worries me is the possibility of escalation, the fact that there's a lot of other parts of the world that are not on Ukraine's side, and that we've got other struggles that will continue regardless of what happens in Ukraine.
Has this emboldened other dictators and other regimes?
I would say it's the opposite. I would say that they're probably chastened by this, and that's one of the potentially good outcomes of this struggle.